The morning mist clung to Chickamauga Creek like a burial shroud, and somewhere in that gray veil, 66,000 men were about to write one of the bloodiest chapters in American history. With their lives. Major General William Stark Rosecrans stood at his field headquarters near Crawfish Spring, Georgia, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gripped his field glasses. The date was September 18, 1863, and the Union Army of the Cumberland was about to face its greatest test. What had begun as a brilliant tactical maneuver to capture the vital railroad hub of Chattanooga was rapidly deteriorating into a nightmare of miscommunication and mounting Confederate resistance. The seeds of this confrontation had been planted months earlier during Rosecrans' highly successful Tullahoma campaign. Through a masterful series of flanking movements and feints, he had outmaneuvered Confederate General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, forcing the rebels to abandon Middle Tennessee. Without a major battle, the campaign had cost the Union a mere 569 casualties while securing vital strategic territory. Flushed with this success, Rosecrans had pressed his advantage, pursuing Bragg across the Tennessee River and into the rugged terrain of northwestern Georgia. But Bragg was no longer retreating. Reinforced by Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps from the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate commander now possessed nearly 65,000 men, roughly equal to Rosecrans' force. More importantly, President Jefferson Davis had given Bragg explicit orders: stop running and destroy the Army of the Cumberland. The Confederate government understood that losing Chattanooga permanently would split the Confederacy in half, cutting off vital supply lines and opening the Deep South to invasion. As dawn broke on September 18th, the Union Army was dangerously scattered across 20 miles of mountainous terrain. Major General Alexander McCook's 20th Corps held the left flank near Alpine, Georgia, while Major General Thomas Leonidas Crittenden's 21st Corps was spread thin near Lee and Gordon's Mill on Chickamauga Creek. The reliable Major General George Henry Thomas commanded the 14th Corps in the center, but even his veterans were stretched to their limits. Trying to maintain contact with the other corps, Rosecrans had made a critical error in judgment. Believing Bragg was still in full retreat toward Atlanta, he had allowed his army to become dangerously dispersed while pursuing what he thought was a beaten enemy. Intelligence reports suggested Confederate forces were fleeing southward, but these reports were tragically wrong. Instead of running, Bragg was concentrating his forces east of Chickamauga Creek, preparing to strike the scattered Union Army piecemeal. The first ominous signs came at dawn. Scouts from Colonel John Thomas Wilder's Mounted Infantry Brigade, equipped with Revolutionary Spencer repeating rifles, reported massive Confederate troop movements across the creek. Wilder's men, known as the Lightning Brigade for their rapid mobility and devastating firepower, had been screening the Army's advance. Their reports painted a disturbing picture. Thousands of Confederate infantry were massing for an assault, supported by cavalry and artillery. General Thomas, whose 14th Corps was positioned near the crossroads settlement of Chickamauga, immediately grasped the danger. A Virginia-born officer who had remained loyal to the Union despite pressure from his Southern origins, Thomas possessed an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and enemy intentions. He dispatched urgent messages to Rosecrans, warning that the Army was walking into a trap. The Confederates weren't retreating, they were preparing to attack. As the morning progressed, the sound of distant gunfire began echoing through the valleys and ridges surrounding Chickamauga Creek. Confederate cavalry under Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest was already probing Union positions, testing for weaknesses in the extended line. Each crack of rifle fire, each rumble of artillery, carried an ominous message. The Army of the Cumberland was about to face the fight of its life. According to historical accounts documented by the American Battlefield Trust, the stage was now set for what would become the second bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War. The morning of September 18th had dawned quietly enough, but by nightfall, the thunder of artillery and the screams of wounded men would echo across the Georgia wilderness, marking the beginning of a battle that would test the very soul of both armies and determine the fate of the Western theater of war. The first shots of the Battle of Chickamauga rang out at 1:30. 7 on the morning of September 19th, when Brigadier General John Beatty's brigade of Thomas's corps encountered Confederate cavalry near Reed's Bridge. What began as a minor skirmish would explode into a full-scale battle within hours, as both armies fed more and more troops into the growing maelstrom. General Thomas had spent the pre-dawn hours frantically repositioning his corps to face the emerging Confederate threat. His instincts, honed by decades of frontier service and combat experience, told him that Bragg was attempting to turn the Union left flank and cut off the Army's line of retreat to Chattanooga. Thomas understood that holding the roads leading north to the vital supply base was absolutely critical. If the Confederates could sever those lifelines, the Army of the Cumberland would be trapped in hostile territory with dwindling ammunition and provisions. The terrain around Chickamauga Creek favored the defenders. Dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine created natural obstacles that channeled attacking forces into narrow corridors. Steep ravines and rocky outcroppings provided excellent defensive positions, while the thick underbrush limited visibility to mere yards in some areas. This was not country for grand tactical maneuvers or coordinated mass assaults. Instead, it would be a soldier's fight small unit actions decided by individual courage and the deadly accuracy of rifled muskets. As Beatty's men engaged the Confederate cavalry, the sound of gunfire drew more units into the battle like iron filings to a magnet. Brigadier General Absalom Baird's division rushed to support Beatty, while Confederate infantry under Major General William Henry Talbot Walker began crossing Chickamauga Creek in force. Walker, a Georgia native whose men called him Shot Pouch due to his habit of carrying ammunition personal light to the front lines, was determined to establish a foothold on the western side of the creek. The fighting intensified rapidly as both sides committed additional forces. Colonel Daniel McCook's brigade of Baird's division found itself locked in a vicious firefight with Walker's Georgians near the Alexander Bridge. The Confederates had the advantage of numbers, but the Union troops held superior defensive positions among the timber and rocks. Rifle fire crackled through the forest like a deadly thunderstorm, while artillery batteries on both sides hurled case shot and canister into the swirling combat. By 10 o'clock in the morning, General Rosecrans realized that his army was facing a major Confederate offensive, not the rear guard action he had initially expected. From his headquarters, he could hear the steadily intensifying gunfire rolling across the countryside. Like an approaching tempest, urgent messages from Thomas painted an increasingly dire picture. Confederate forces were crossing Chickamauga Creek at multiple points, threatening to overwhelm the Union left flank through sheer weight of numbers. Rosecrans immediately ordered McCook's 20th Corps to march north from Alpine. To support Thomas, the movement would take hours to complete over the rough mountain roads, but it was essential to concentrate the scattered army before Bragg could defeat it in detail. Similarly, Crittenden's 21st Corps received orders to abandon its positions near Lee and Gordon's Mill and move north to extend the Union line. The battle's intensity continued to escalate throughout the morning. Confederate reinforcements arrived steadily as Bragg fed more divisions into the assault. Major General Patrick Ronayne Colburn's Arkansas and Texas veterans attacked Baird's position with their characteristic ferocity, while Major General Benjamin Franklin Cheatham's Tennessee Division struck further south. The Confederates were fighting with a desperation born of understanding that this might be their last chance to destroy a Union army and potentially change the war's trajectory. Union resistance was equally determined. Thomas's corps had earned its reputation as one of the most reliable commands in the Western theater, and his men responded to the crisis with characteristic steadiness. The 14th Corps included veteran regiments from Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, men who had fought at Shiloh, Stones River, and in the Tullahoma campaign. They understood the stakes as clearly as their Confederate opponents. The forest battles created scenes of incredible confusion and heroism in the dense underbrush. Company commanders lost contact with their regiments, while regimental commanders struggled to maintain contact with brigade headquarters. Soldiers fought in small groups, often unable to see more than a few yards in any direction. The crack of Springfield and Enfield rifles echoed continuously, punctuated by the deeper roar of artillery and the screams of wounded men. By noon, the battle had spread along a front of nearly 4 miles, from Reed's Bridge in the north to Lee and Gordon's Mill in the south. Both armies were fully committed now, with over 100,000 men locked in desperate combat along Chickamauga Creek. The morning's skirmishing had grown into one of the largest battles ever fought on American soil, and the outcome remained desperately uncertain. As the afternoon sun climbed higher on September 19th, the Battle of Chickamauga transformed into a hellish maze of separate firefights, scattered throughout the dense Georgia wilderness. The initial Confederate assault on the Union left had evolved into a sprawling engagement that stretched across miles of difficult terrain. With neither army able to gain decisive advantage in the tangled forest, General Thomas found himself commanding what had effectively become the most critical sector of the entire Union line. His 14th Corps, reinforced by elements of Crittenden's 21st Corps, held a precarious position along the Lafayette Road, the main highway leading north to Chattanooga. Confederate attacks came in waves throughout the afternoon, each one threatening to break through and cut the Union Army's vital supply line. The arrival of Confederate Lieutenant General James Longstreet's veterans from Virginia had dramatically altered the balance of forces. These were the same soldiers who had fought at Gettysburg just 2 months earlier, tough professionals who understood the art of battlefield maneuver. Longstreet himself, Lee's most trusted Corps commander, brought tactical expertise that complemented Bragg's numerical advantage. However, the Georgian terrain negated many of the advantages that these experienced troops normally possessed. Colonel John Wilder's Lightning Brigade continued to play a crucial role in the Union defense, armed with Spencer repeating rifles that could fire 7 rounds without reloading. Wilder's mounted infantry delivered devastating firepower from carefully chosen positions. The Spencers gave each Union soldier the equivalent firepower of several Confederate infantry, armed with single-shot muskets. When Confederate forces approached Wilder's positions, they faced a wall of rapid rifle fire that seemed impossibly dense. For the number of defenders visible, the forest fighting created tactical nightmares for commanders on both sides. Traditional military formations became impossible to maintain in the thick underbrush. Regiments advanced in loose skirmish lines, feeling their way forward through the timber until they encountered enemy fire. Artillery, normally the decisive arm in Civil War battles, found its effectiveness severely limited by the terrain. Cannons could only be positioned along roads or in the few small clearings, reducing their ability to support infantry attacks. Major General Patrick Coburn's Confederate division made perhaps the most determined assault of the afternoon against Thomas's positions. Near the Brotherton Farm, Coburn, an Irish immigrant who had become one of the Confederacy's finest division commanders, personally led his Arkansas and Texas regiments forward through the forest. His men advanced with the wild yells that had made Confederate infantry famous, but they met withering fire from behind hastily constructed log breastworks. The fighting around the Brotherton cabin became particularly savage. Union soldiers from Ohio and Indiana regiments had fortified the small clearing, using fence rails and fallen logs to create defensive positions. Wave after wave of Confederate infantry charged across the small field, only to be driven back by concentrated rifle fire. The ground around the cabin became littered with casualties from both armies, while the wooden structure itself was splintered by bullets and artillery fragments. As afternoon turned toward evening, both armies showed signs of exhaustion. Soldiers had been fighting continuously for 8 hours in oppressive heat and humidity. Water was scarce, ammunition was running low in many units, and medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded men. The thick gun smoke that filled the forest created an additional hazard, reducing visibility and making coordination between units even more difficult. General Rosecrans spent the afternoon frantically trying to coordinate his scattered corps. Messages took hours to reach their destinations over the rough terrain, and by the time orders arrived, tactical situations had often changed completely. The army that had begun the campaign in excellent order was showing dangerous signs of disorganization. Under the stress of continuous combat, Confederate commanders faced similar challenges. General Bragg's notorious difficulties with subordinate commanders became apparent. As the battle progressed, several division commanders complained that their attacks lacked proper coordination with supporting units. The dense terrain that hindered Union communications affected Confederate forces equally, making it difficult to exploit local successes or reinforce threatened positions quickly. Despite these command problems, Confederate forces maintained their aggressive pressure throughout the afternoon. General Forrest's cavalry continued to probe the Union flanks, looking for weak points that infantry could exploit. Meanwhile, fresh Confederate brigades arrived regularly from the east, crossing Chickamauga Creek at multiple fords and bridges to join the assault. By 5 o'clock in the evening, casualties on both sides had reached staggering levels. Field hospitals established in farmhouses and barns were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers. Surgeons worked by lamplight, performing amputations and treating gunshot wounds while the battle raged nearby. The primitive medical knowledge of the era meant that many soldiers who might have survived with modern treatment died from infections or blood loss. As darkness approached, the intensity of fighting gradually diminished. Exhausted soldiers on both sides began digging in for what promised to be a long night. Neither army had achieved its objectives during the first day's fighting, but the tactical situation clearly favored the Confederates. They had successfully concentrated their forces and were attacking a Union army that remained dangerously scattered across difficult terrain. Darkness fell over the Chickamauga battlefield like a blessing to the exhausted soldiers of both armies, but the night of September 19th brought little rest to the commanders, who understood that the coming dawn would likely decide the fate of the Western theater. The forest, which had echoed with rifle fire and artillery all day, now filled with the groans of wounded men and the whispered conversations of soldiers preparing for what promised to be an even more desperate fight. General Thomas spent the nighttime hours strengthening his defensive positions along the Lafayette Road. His engineers and infantry worked by moonlight, felling trees and constructing log breastworks that would give his men some protection against the Confederate assault that would surely come with first light. Thomas understood better than anyone that his corps held the key to the entire Union position. If the Confederates could break through his lines and capture the road to Chattanooga, the Army of the Cumberland would be trapped and likely destroyed. The general himself moved constantly among his troops during the dark hours, checking defensive preparations and bolstering morale. Soldiers who glimpsed his tall, bearded figure in the moonlight drew confidence from his calm presence. Thomas had earned his men's trust through 2 years of competent leadership, and they knew he would not ask them to hold positions that could not be defended. His quiet Virginia drawl and steady demeanor provided a sharp contrast to the hysteria that seemed to be affecting other parts of the Union command structure. Meanwhile, at Army headquarters, General Rosecrans was struggling to maintain control of his scattered forces. The day's fighting had revealed serious weaknesses in Union communications and coordination. Messages between corps took hours to deliver, and Rosecrans found himself trying to command a battle based on information that was often hours out of date. The pressure was taking a visible toll on the Army commander, who had begun showing signs of the nervous exhaustion that would ultimately cost him his command. McCook's 20th Corps had finally arrived on the battlefield after its grueling march from Alpine, but the men were exhausted from covering 24 miles over mountain roads in oppressive heat. Many soldiers had collapsed from heat stroke during the march, and those who reached the battlefield were in no condition for immediate combat. Nevertheless, McCook began positioning his divisions to extend the Union left flank, hoping to prevent Confederate forces from turning the Army's position on the Confederate side. General Bragg was experiencing his own command difficulties. The successful concentration of his army had been marred by poor coordination between his subordinate commanders. Several promising attacks during the day had failed due to inadequate support or timing problems. Bragg's harsh personality and tendency to blame subordinates for tactical failures had created an atmosphere of tension among his generals that interfered with effective cooperation. Lieutenant General Longstreet arrived at Confederate headquarters near midnight, having spent the evening reconnoitering the Union positions with his staff officers. The veteran Virginia commander brought disturbing news. Union defensive preparations were more extensive than Bragg had anticipated. Thomas's corps had constructed formidable breastworks along the Lafayette Road, and additional Union forces were arriving to strengthen the line. Longstreet recommended postponing the attack until Confederate artillery could be properly positioned to support the assault. However, Bragg was determined to attack at dawn. Intelligence reports suggested that the Union Army was demoralized and on the verge of retreat. Confederate cavalry scouts reported that supply wagons were moving north toward Chattanooga, which Bragg interpreted as evidence that Rosecrans was preparing to abandon his positions. The Confederate commander believed that one more massive assault would shatter Union resistance and destroy the Army of the Cumberland entirely. The night was filled with ominous sounds that kept nervous soldiers awake on both sides. Axes rang against tree trunks as work parties strengthened defensive positions. Artillery crews wrestled their cannons into new positions, the wheels creaking and chains rattling in the darkness. Most disturbing of all were the cries of wounded men scattered throughout the forest, many of whom would not survive until medical help could reach them. Field hospitals on both sides worked frantically to treat the day's casualties. Surgeons performed operations by candlelight and lantern flame, their instruments crude by modern standards, but effective enough to save lives when expertly used. The primitive medical knowledge of 1863 meant that many soldiers died from wounds that would be easily treatable today. Infection, blood loss, and shock claimed victims throughout the night, adding to casualty lists that were already approaching devastating levels. Fresh Confederate reinforcements continued, arriving during the night hours. General Daniel Harvey Hill's corps, recently transferred from North Carolina, took positions on the Confederate right flank. Hill, a former college professor known for his tactical expertise and sharp tongue, brought additional veteran troops to an army that already outnumbered its Union opponents. His rival gave Bragg nearly 70,000 men, a significant advantage over Rosecrans' force. As dawn approached on September 20th, both armies prepared for what commanders on both sides understood would be a decisive battle. The first day's fighting had been savage but inconclusive. The coming day would determine whether the Union could maintain its hold on the Western theater, or whether Confederate forces would achieve the decisive victory that might change the entire course of the American Civil War. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest days in American military history. Dawn on September 20th, 1863, broke gray and humid over the Chickamauga battlefield, revealing two armies locked in positions that would soon explode into some of the most ferocious fighting of the entire Civil War. The morning mist that rose from the creek carried with it the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sickly sweet odor of blood from the previous day's carnage. General Bragg's battle plan was ambitious in its scope and devastating in its potential consequences. He intended to launch a series of coordinated attacks along the entire Union line. Beginning on his right flank and rolling northward like a thunderclap, the assault would commence with Breckinridge's corps attacking Thomas's positions near Kelly Field, followed by successive attacks by Hill, Polk, and finally Longstreet's corps against the Union center and right. If executed properly, the plan would prevent Rosecrans from shifting troops to meet each assault and would eventually break the Union line through sheer weight of concentrated force. The battle began at approximately 9:30 in the morning, when Major General John Cabell Breckinridge's Kentucky veterans launched their assault against Thomas's breastworks. Breckinridge, the former Vice President of the United States, who had joined the Confederate cause, led his men forward with characteristic gallantry. His soldiers advanced through the forest with their battle flags flying, their voices raised in the piercing Confederate yell that had become the signature sound of Southern infantry attacks. Thomas's men waited behind their log fortifications with the patience of veterans who understood the value of defensive fire. As the Confederate line emerged from the timber into the small clearings round Kelly Field, Union rifle fire erupted from multiple positions simultaneously. The 14th Corps had learned its lessons well during 2 years of hard campaigning, and Thomas had positioned his regiments to create overlapping fields of fire. That turned the approaches to his line into killing zones. The Confederate assault broke against Thomas's defenses like ocean waves against granite cliffs. Wave after wave of gray-clad infantry charged forward, only to be driven back by the concentrated fire of Spencer repeating rifles and rifled muskets. The ground in front of the Union breastworks became carpeted with Confederate casualties, but still the attacks continued. Breckinridge's men displayed the kind of desperate courage that had made Confederate infantry famous throughout the war. As the morning progressed, the fighting spread southward along the Union line. General Hill's corps joined the assault, attacking positions held by elements of Crittenden's 21st Corps. The fighting in this sector was equally savage, with Confederate forces making several temporary breaches in the Union line before being driven back by desperate counterattacks. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides as soldiers fought at point-blank range in the dense forest. General Rosecrans spent the morning rushing from crisis to crisis along his extended line. The Union commander was clearly feeling the strain of commanding a battle that seemed to be spinning out of control. Messages arrived constantly reporting Confederate breakthroughs, requests for reinforcements, and ammunition shortages. Rosecrans found himself frantically shifting troops from quiet sectors to meet each new Confederate assault, gradually weakening his overall position. The critical moment came shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning, triggered by a tragic miscommunication that would haunt the Union Army for generations. Rosecrans received a report suggesting that Brigadier General Thomas John Wood's division had been driven from its position, creating a gap in the Union line near the Brotherton Farm. Without personally verifying this information, Rosecrans ordered Wood to close up on Reynolds and support him, intending to fill what he believed was a dangerous hole in his defenses. Wood's reaction to this order would become one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war. The general had been severely criticized by Rosecrans earlier in the campaign for what the Army commander considered excessive independence in interpreting orders. Determined to follow his instructions to the letter this time, Wood withdrew his division from its position and began moving north to close up on Reynolds, even though doing so created an actual gap in the Union line where none had existed before. Lieutenant General Longstreet, positioned with his corps opposite the Union center, witnessed Wood's withdrawal with the keen eye of a professional soldier who had spent decades studying battlefield tactics. This was precisely the opportunity he had been waiting for. Since arriving from Virginia, Longstreet immediately ordered his corps forward in a massive assault aimed directly at the gap Wood's movement had created. The Confederate attack struck with devastating force. 8 brigades of veteran infantry, supported by artillery and cavalry, poured through the breach in the Union line like water through a broken dam. These were the same soldiers who had fought at 2nd Manassas, Antietam, and Gettysburg, men who understood how to exploit tactical opportunities with ruthless efficiency. Leading the charge was Major General Jerome Bonaparte Robertson's Texas Brigade, whose reputation for ferocity was matched only by their tactical skill. The right side of the Union Army collapsed almost instantaneously. Entire regiments found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed before they could react to the crisis. Artillery batteries were overrun, their crews cut down while trying to limber their guns for retreat. Supply wagons filled with ammunition and medical supplies fell into Confederate hands, along with hundreds of prisoners who had no choice but to surrender when surrounded. General McCook's entire 20th Corps was caught in the disaster. McCook himself barely escaped capture, and 2 of his 3 divisions were scattered and demoralized by the Confederate breakthrough. Brigadier General Jefferson Columbus Davis's division simply disintegrated under the impact of Longstreet's assault, its regiments fleeing northward in complete disorder. The psychological impact of the breakthrough was almost as devastating as its tactical consequences. Union soldiers who witnessed the collapse of their right flank began to panic, spreading word that the entire army was defeated. This created a domino effect that threatened to destroy the Army of the Cumberland's cohesion completely. According to historical analysis by the American Battlefield Trust, Longstreet's assault represented one of the most successful tactical movements of the entire Civil War, demonstrating how professional leadership and veteran troops could exploit even small mistakes to achieve decisive results. As Longstreet's devastating breakthrough shattered the Union right flank, the Army of the Cumberland teetered on the edge of total collapse. Panic spread through the retreating regiments like wildfire, and for a terrifying moment, it appeared that General Bragg's dream of destroying an entire Union army was about to become reality. But standing firm against this tide of disaster was Major General George Henry Thomas and his 14th Corps, positioned along Snodgrass Hill and the northern portion of the battlefield. Thomas received word of the catastrophe unfolding to his south at approximately noon, as his own men were still engaged in desperate fighting against Breckinridge's continued assaults. Staff officers brought reports that seemed almost impossible to believe. The entire right half of the army was retreating toward Chattanooga. McCook's corps was scattered, and Confederate forces were pouring through a massive gap in the Union line. Any lesser commander might have ordered an immediate retreat to avoid being cut off and surrounded. Instead, Thomas made a decision that would earn him immortality in American military history. Rather than retreat with the rest of the army, he would hold his positions and buy time for the routed forces to reorganize. This was not a decision made lightly. Thomas understood that he was essentially sacrificing his corps to save the army. His men would have to hold their ground against overwhelming odds, while the rest of the Union forces escaped northward to the safety of Chattanooga's fortifications. The general immediately began repositioning his available forces to create a defensive line along Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge. These elevated positions offered excellent fields of fire and natural obstacles that would make Confederate attacks extremely costly. Thomas ordered his men to construct additional breastworks using fence rails, logs, and stones, anything that could stop bullets and provide protection for his soldiers. Reinforcements began arriving piecemeal as scattered units from the broken right flank rallied to Thomas's position. Brigadier General James Blair Steedman's Reserve Corps, which had been held back during the morning's fighting, marched rapidly to join the defense. General John MacArthur Palmer's division, which had managed to maintain its organization during the retreat, also joined Thomas's desperate stand. These additional troops brought the Union force on Snodgrass Hill to approximately 25,000 men. Confederate commanders quickly recognized the threat posed by Thomas's continued resistance. As long as the 14th Corps held its positions, the Union Army retained an organized fighting force that could potentially counterattack or at least prevent complete Confederate exploitation of their breakthrough. General Bragg ordered multiple divisions to assault Snodgrass Hill, intending to crush this last pocket of Union resistance before nightfall. The afternoon attacks against Thomas's position were among the most savage of the entire battle. Wave after wave of Confederate infantry charged up the steep slopes of Snodgrass Hill, only to be driven back by devastating rifle fire from behind the hastily constructed breastworks. The fighting was so intense that rifle barrels became too hot to touch, and soldiers had to wrap their weapons in wet cloth to continue firing. Longstreet's corps, flushed with victory from their breakthrough, joined the assaults against Thomas's positions. These veteran troops expected to overwhelm what they assumed was a demoralized Union rear guard, but they encountered resistance that was anything but demoralized. Thomas's men fought with the desperate courage of soldiers who understood that they were buying time with their lives. Every minute they held their positions gave their comrades additional time to reach safety in Chattanooga. Artillery played a crucial role in the defense of Snodgrass Hill. Union battery commanders positioned their guns to sweep the approaches to the ridge with canister and case shot. Confederate infantry formations advancing across the open ground below the hill were devastated by artillery fire that turned entire companies into scattered casualties. The sound of cannon fire echoed continuously across the battlefield, punctuated by the higher-pitched crack of rifle fire and the screams of wounded men. One of the most heroic episodes of the afternoon involved Colonel John Thomas Wilder's Lightning Brigade, which had been operating as mounted infantry throughout the battle. When word reached Wilder of Thomas's desperate situation, he immediately led his men to support the defense. The Spencer repeating rifles carried by Wilder's troopers provided enormous firepower advantages, allowing relatively small numbers of men to hold extended portions of the defensive line. As the afternoon wore on, ammunition began running dangerously low among Thomas's defenders. Soldiers stripped cartridges from the bodies of fallen comrades and enemies alike, while artillery crews fired whatever projectiles they could find: rocks, pieces of metal, even broken tools. Supply wagons that had escaped the morning's disaster made desperate runs up the hill, their drivers whipping their horses through Confederate fire to deliver ammunition and medical supplies. The fighting continued until well after dark, with muzzle flashes lighting up the forest like deadly fireflies. Confederate commanders launched several night assaults, hoping to overwhelm the Union defenses under cover of darkness, but Thomas's men held firm. The ridge had become a fortress, held by soldiers who understood that their sacrifice was preserving the Army of the Cumberland from complete destruction. By 10 o'clock that evening, Confederate attacks finally ceased. Longstreet and other Confederate generals recommended that Bragg continue the assault through the night, arguing that Thomas's position could still be overrun with sufficient pressure. However, Bragg decided to allow his exhausted troops to rest and resume the attack at dawn. This decision would prove to be a crucial mistake. It gave Thomas the opportunity he needed to organize a fighting withdrawal. During the night hours of September 20th, Thomas received orders from General Rosecrans to retreat to Chattanooga. The Army commander, who had fled the battlefield during the afternoon's panic, was attempting to reorganize his scattered forces around the city's fortifications. Thomas was to serve as the rear guard, holding his positions until the last possible moment before following the rest of the army northward. The pre-dawn hours of September 21st found General Thomas preparing for one of the most difficult military maneuvers possible: a fighting withdrawal in the face of a superior enemy force. His troops had held Snodgrass Hill through a night of intermittent Confederate assaults, but dawn would bring renewed attacks that his exhausted men might not be able to repel. The challenge now was to extract his corps from their defensive positions without allowing the Confederates to turn an orderly retreat into a complete rout. Thomas began the withdrawal at 4 o'clock in the morning, using the darkness to mask his initial movements. The most seriously wounded men were loaded onto wagons and ambulances, while soldiers who could walk but not fight were formed into provisional companies to help guard the supply train. Artillery crews prepared their guns for rapid movement, knowing that losing the cannons would severely handicap any future defensive efforts around Chattanooga. The general's reputation among his men proved invaluable during these critical hours. Soldiers who might have panicked under other commanders remained calm and disciplined because they trusted Thomas's judgment completely. His quiet competence and obvious concern for their welfare had earned their loyalty through months of hard campaigning. They understood that if Thomas said they could withdraw successfully, then the movement could be accomplished. Confederate pickets detected the Union withdrawal shortly after dawn, and Bragg immediately ordered his available forces to pursue the retreating enemy. However, the Confederate Army was also exhausted after 2 days of savage fighting, and many units were scattered across the battlefield collecting prisoners and captured equipment. The pursuit was therefore somewhat disorganized, allowing Thomas's rear guard to maintain better order than might otherwise have been possible. The retreat followed the Lafayette Road northward toward Rossville Gap, the mountain pass that controlled access to Chattanooga from the south. Thomas had positioned strong rear guard detachments at key points along the route, forcing Confederate pursuers to deploy and attack each position before continuing their advance. This series of delaying actions slowed the Confederate pursuit significantly and allowed the main Union force to maintain its lead. Colonel Wilder's Lightning Brigade again distinguished itself during the withdrawal, using their mobility and firepower to strike Confederate columns attempting to flank the retreating army. The Spencer repeating rifles continued to provide enormous tactical advantages, allowing small detachments of Union cavalry to hold off much larger Confederate forces. For extended periods, Wilder's men fought a series of brilliant delaying actions that bought precious time for Thomas's infantry. The fighting at Rossville Gap proved to be the climactic action of the entire Chickamauga campaign. Confederate forces under General Forrest arrived at the Gap shortly after noon, hoping to cut off Thomas's retreat. before the Union corps could reach the safety of Chattanooga's fortifications. However, Thomas had anticipated this maneuver and had positioned strong defensive forces in the gap under General Steedman's command. The battle for Rossville Gap lasted 3 hours and involved some of the war's most desperate fighting. Confederate cavalry and infantry launched repeated assaults against Union positions among the rocks and timber of the mountain pass. Steedman's men, fighting from carefully prepared positions, held their ground against overwhelming odds. The narrow confines of the gap negated Confederate numerical advantages and allowed Union defenders to concentrate their fire against each attacking force. As evening approached, Thomas received word that the last elements of his corps had passed through Rossville Gap and were approaching Chattanooga's outer defenses. The Army of the Cumberland had survived the Battle of Chickamauga, though at enormous cost. Union casualties totaled approximately 16,000 men, while Confederate losses exceeded 18,000. Despite winning a tactical victory, Bragg's army had suffered losses it could not afford and had failed to destroy its Union opponents. The strategic consequences of Chickamauga became apparent over the following weeks. Although Bragg had won the battle, he had not achieved the decisive victory that Confederate strategy required. The Army of the Cumberland remained intact and was rapidly reinforced by troops from other theaters. Meanwhile, Confederate casualties had been so severe that Bragg could not exploit his tactical success. By immediately attacking Chattanooga's fortifications, Thomas's heroic stand at Snodgrass Hill had saved not just his own corps, but potentially the entire Union war effort in the Western Theater. His performance during the battle earned him the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga, a title that would follow him for the rest of his distinguished career. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw both armies licking their wounds while preparing for the next phase of the campaign. Rosecrans consolidated his forces within Chattanooga's fortifications, while Bragg positioned his army on the surrounding heights, effectively besieging the Union force. However, the Confederate commander's failure to pursue his advantage immediately after the battle would prove to be a strategic error of enormous proportions. Within weeks, the Lincoln administration responded to the crisis by rushing reinforcements to Chattanooga from multiple theaters. Major General Joseph Hook arrived with 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac, while General William Tecumseh Sherman brought additional forces from Mississippi. Most significantly, General Ulysses Simpson Grant was placed in overall command of Union forces in the Western Theater, bringing with him the aggressive leadership that the situation demanded. The Battle of Chickamauga had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of Confederate military power in the war's middle period. Bragg's army had achieved a stunning tactical victory through superior concentration of forces and expert exploitation of Union mistakes. However, the Confederacy's limited manpower reserves meant that even victories came at costs that could not be sustained indefinitely. The 18,000 casualties suffered at Chickamauga represented irreplaceable losses of veteran soldiers and experienced officers. For the Union, Chickamauga represented a painful but valuable learning experience. The battle revealed serious weaknesses in Army-level command and communication that would be addressed in subsequent campaigns. More importantly, it demonstrated the crucial importance of competent leadership at the corps and division level. Thomas's performance showed that individual excellence could overcome institutional failures and save entire armies from destruction. The strategic situation in the Western Theater was ultimately transformed by the events at Chickamauga, though not in the way Confederate leaders had hoped. Rather than destroying the Union presence in Tennessee, the battle led to a massive reinforcement of Union forces that would eventually prove decisive. Within 2 months, Grant's forces would break the siege of Chattanooga and drive Bragg's army back into Georgia, setting the stage for Sherman's devastating Atlanta campaign. The human cost of Chickamauga was staggering for both sides. Over 34,000 American soldiers had become casualties during the days of fighting in the Georgia wilderness. Families across the nation received news of sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return home. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded men, many of whom would die from infections and complications in the days following the battle. The primitive medical knowledge of 1863 meant That survival often depended more on luck than on the quality of treatment received. For the soldiers who survived Chickamauga, the battle became a defining experience that shaped their understanding of warfare and sacrifice. Veterans of both armies would carry memories of those terrible September days for the rest of their lives. The savage fighting in the dense forests, the screams of wounded comrades, and the constant presence of death became part of their personal histories and contributed to the collective trauma that would mark an entire generation of Americans. As the armies settled into their new positions round Chattanooga, the Battle of Chickamauga took its place as one of the war's bloodiest and most significant engagements. The Confederate tactical victory had come at too high a price and had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Meanwhile, the Union defeat had paradoxically strengthened Federal resolve and led to command changes that would prove decisive. In subsequent campaigns, the creek that gave the battle its name, Chickamauga, which meant River of Death in the Cherokee language, had lived up to its ominous translation. The waters that had run red with blood during those September days in 1863 would forever after serve as a reminder of the terrible cost of America's internal conflict and the courage of the men who fought there. In the broader context of the Civil War, Chickamauga marked the last major Confederate victory in the Western theater. Bragg's success would soon be overshadowed by Union triumphs at Chattanooga, Atlanta, and during Sherman's march to the sea. The battle had demonstrated that Confederate forces could still achieve tactical victories against Union armies, but it had also revealed the strategic limitations that would ultimately doom the Southern cause. The Army of Tennessee would never again possess the strength to threaten Union control of the Western theater decisively. The legacy of Chickamauga lives on in American military history as an example of both tactical brilliance and strategic failure. For Confederate forces, it represented the kind of victory that the South needed but could not afford. For Union forces, it demonstrated the importance of competent leadership and the resilience of American soldiers in the face of disaster. Most importantly, it showed how individual acts of heroism like Thomas's stand at Snodgrass Hill could change the course of entire campaigns and potentially alter the fate of nations. The battle's lessons would influence military thinking for generations, demonstrating the importance of communication, coordination, and flexible leadership in modern warfare. The dense forest fighting that characterized much of the engagement foreshadowed the tactical challenges that would dominate warfare in the 20th century, when traditional formations and grand maneuvers would give way to small unit actions and individual initiative. Today, the Chickamauga battlefield is preserved as a national military park, where visitors can walk the same ground where Thomas earned his immortal nickname, and where thousands of American soldiers demonstrated the highest qualities of military courage and sacrifice. The monuments and markers that dot the landscape serve as enduring reminders of those September days, when the fate of the American Republic hung in the balance, decided ultimately by the steadfast courage of men who refused to yield when their nation needed them most.